Hello everyone, and welcome to the Dillon Eustace Insights webinar on ESG. Our speakers today are Dillon Eustace partners Cillian Breeden and Aisling O'Malley. This is webinar 1 of a two-part series on ESG. Many of you will know Cillian, who is a partner in Dillon Eustace's Asset Management and Investment Funds team. Cillian is a specialist in investment funds and advises on a broad range of legal and regulatory matters. His clients include privately owned and institutional investment managers representing a wide range of asset classes. Cillian has also spent time on secondment in London and within the legal department of a large US bank and in Dillon Eustace's Cayman offices. Aisling O'Malley is also a partner in the Asset Management and Investment Funds team. Her extensive experience includes a wide range of legal and regulatory matters covering the structuring, establishment and regulation of all types of mutual funds, UCITS, AIFs, as well as advising on establishing and operating UCITS management companies and AIFMs. As I mentioned, the topic of today's webinar is an introduction to the key concepts and impacts of the ESG framework, or put simply, the ABC of ESG. The key objective for today's webinar is to give you, the audience, a firm grounding in this very important emerging area. Over the course of the 30 minutes, Cillian and Aisling will give you an overview of the key concepts of the wide-ranging ESG framework and how it impacts funds and their management companies. Cillian and Aisling will present for approximately 30 minutes, finishing up with a few minutes Q&A. The ground rules for today: everybody is muted, but we really do encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which we will call out at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded, and without further delay, I will pass you over to Cillian and Aisling.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Clodagh, and hello to everyone who has joined today's webinar. We really do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend the first of our two-part series on ESG. Now, to begin with the question, where is this coming from and why? As you will no doubt be aware, the EU has set in motion an ambitious legislative framework to make environmental, social and governance concerns a central building block of regulation in the financial services industry. Now, as listeners will appreciate, financial services firms can play a key role in the transition to a more sustainable economy by redirecting capital flows towards sustainable investments. In this respect, the EU view is that in order to meet the ambitious targets set down by the EU Commission, public investment is not sufficient and significant private investment will be required. In order to generate that adequate private investment, the EU intends to require fund managers to provide adequate disclosure to investors so that they can be given information which will allow them to choose truly sustainable products and eliminate the concept of greenwashing. And greenwashing is a name given to the practice of gaining an unfair competitive advantage by marketing a financial product as environmentally friendly, when in fact it does not meet basic environmental standards. So in summary, the core idea here is that by requiring fund managers to disclose information on how they integrate sustainability risks and consider the impact of investment decision-making on sustainability factors, this will support and encourage the growth of sustainable finance. So simply put, the framework is designed to encourage investors and as a result their investment managers to invest in the right type of companies which act responsibly and take action to bring about positive environmental and social changes. So exactly how the EU is looking to achieve this goal is what we're going to cover in today's webinar. As set out in the slide, the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance identifies 10 key points rather. But for funds and their management companies, the focus of today's talk, the key proposals in this regard relate to 4 overriding concerns. Firstly, strengthening the disclosure made to investors. Secondly, incorporating sustainability as part of the investment decision-making process. Thirdly, establishing a taxonomy or classification system for sustainable activities. And finally, developing sustainability benchmarks and better integrating sustainability into ratings. As you'll see from this next slide, to assist in giving you a good understanding of how these objectives are being acted upon by the EU, we have outlined each of the key pieces of legislation which make up this ESG framework. There are 4 key legislative initiatives which make up this framework, namely the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations, or SFDR, also known as the Disclosure Regulations, the Taxonomy Regulations, the proposed amendments to the UCITS and AIF&G framework, And finally, then the low carbon benchmark regulations. Now, familiarizing yourself with the objectives and the timing around each of these pieces of legislation is a key to understanding what kind of impact the ESG framework will have on your business. So what are the key objectives for these legislative initiatives? Well, for the disclosure regulations, the key objective, as you might have guessed, is to provide for consistent disclosure requirements in relation to sustainability. The taxonomy regulations, meanwhile, seek to create a unified classification system for sustainable activities. In addition, amendments are being made to the UCITS and AIF&D frameworks to impose legislative obligations on UCITS management companies and AIFMs to integrate sustainability risks and, where relevant, the consideration of sustainability factors into their operations. Finally, then, the low carbon benchmark regulations aim to provide standardized sustainability benchmarks for the industry. As you'll see from the following slide, we have, just for completeness purposes, also set out each of the timeframes and deadlines related to the various pieces of legislation, which I've just mentioned. Now, throughout this webinar, we will be highlighting these dates as they will impact you, but suffice to say that at this stage, it is the 10th of March 2021 for the SFDR disclosure regulations. This is the first of the key regulatory deadlines which needs to be met, and this naturally is to the front of managers' minds at the minute. More on that a little bit later on. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to Aisling to discuss some of the key concepts of the ESG framework.
Thank you, Cillian, and again, a very warm welcome to you all. Before we look further at the key pieces of legislation which Cillian just mentioned, it's worth highlighting a number of key concepts that crop up throughout the legislation and which you'll hear us discuss during the course of this webinar. The first of those is sustainable finance. And as Cillian mentioned, the European Commission has introduced this new ESG framework in order to support and grow sustainable finance in the EU. But what is sustainable finance? Essentially, it's the process under which environmental, social, and governance considerations are taken into account when making investment decisions. And this push towards sustainable finance essentially operates at two levels. Firstly, it encourages fund managers to consider the impact of their investment decision-making process on sustainability factors. And secondly, it encourages investors to choose sustainable investments when deciding how to invest their monies. What then lies behind the E, the S, and the G of ESG? Environmental considerations refer to climate change mitigation, for example, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change adaptation refers to, for example, using scarce water resources more efficiently or building flood defences, as well as environmental issues more broadly, for example, pollution and land use, and environmental related risks, i.e. natural disasters. Social considerations may refer to issues of inequality, inclusiveness, labour relations, and investment in human capital and communities. And governance then takes into account the governance of both public and private institutions, including management structures, employee relations, and executive remuneration, as this plays a fundamental role in ensuring the inclusion of social and environmental considerations in the decision-making process. The next key concept is that of sustainability risk, and this is defined as an environmental, social, or governance event or condition that, if it occurs, could cause an actual or potential material negative impact on the value of the investment. As you'll hear us discuss a little later on, fund managers will have to disclose to investors their policies on the integration of sustainability risks in their investment decision-making process. And this essentially addresses whether or not a fund manager, when making investment decisions and building their portfolio, considers whether the value of an underlying investment could be materially negatively affected by an ESG event. Some very simple examples include a hurricane, flooding, oil spills, or perhaps poor labour practices within a company. These are ESG events which may negatively affect the value of a particular investment. This additional disclosure is intended to increase awareness of sustainability risks on the part of investors. Moving on then to sustainability impact, and this is the impact that investment decisions have on sustainability factors, which in turn are defined as environmental, social and employee matters, respect for human rights, anti-corruption and anti-bribery matters. In other words, when a fund manager is considering the sustainability impact of an investment, they're essentially looking at how environmental and social matters may be impacted as a result of their choosing to invest in a particular investment. Another key concept that doesn't appear on this slide is that of an ESG fund, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes. However, before doing so, let's turn to the next slide to firstly see who is impacted under the disclosure regulation. The disclosure obligations will apply at both entity level and a product level. Within scope at the entity level are financial market participants and financial advisors. And these include UCITS management companies, self-managed UCITS investment companies, AIFM and internally managed AIF, and MiFID II investment firms. And at product level, UCITS, AIFs, and separately managed accounts are in scope. Moving on then to the next slide. For those non-EU AIFM and investment managers which have joined the webinar, you may be asking the question, does this new ESG framework impact me? And the short answer is, you may be impacted. It appears, and this is subject to any further clarification being issued by the European Commission or ESMA, that the disclosure requirements set down under the disclosure regulation relating specifically to the prospectus and periodic reports, which Killian will speak to in a moment, will be imposed on any AIFM which manages an EU fund or which markets an AIF within the EEA. Within AIFMD, the term AIFM is not defined as being restricted solely to an EU authorised AIFM, and as a result, non-EU AIFM may be impacted in such circumstances. With regard then to non-EU investment managers, they will not be subject to any direct obligations under the disclosure regulation or the taxonomy regulation. However, they are likely to be indirectly impacted, and the reason being is that where an EU fund manager is delegating discretionary management to a non-EU investment manager, that EU manager may require information from the non-EU investment manager in order to comply with its own obligations under the ESG framework, and as a result may seek to impose contractual obligations on the non-EU investment manager to provide them with the relevant information that they need. Brexit is also worth mentioning insofar as the UK government has not yet committed to full alignment to the ESG framework once the transition period expires, and it has essentially adopted a wait and see approach to assess the level 2 measures under the disclosure regulation. Depending on the approach taken, it could be the case that global asset managers have clashing regulatory regimes. Should that occur, relevant entities may choose to comply with the more onerous set of obligations across their entire fund range, so as not to be subject to two differing applications of the ESG framework. Moving on then to the next slide. It's worth noting that the extent of the obligations set down under the disclosure regulation will very much depend on whether the manager manages an ESG fund or not. So looking at what is considered to be an ESG fund, there are essentially two types. Firstly, funds that promote environmental or social characteristics, although not exclusively, and which invest in companies that follow good governance practices. These are referred to as light green funds or Article 8 funds. And then there are those funds which have an objective of sustainable investments or reducing carbon emissions. And these funds are referred to as dark green funds or Article 9 funds. Before we look further at the distinction between Article 8 and Article 9 funds, let's firstly consider what is meant by a sustainable investment. So sustainable investment is defined as an investment which contributes to either an environmental objective or a social objective, and the investee company follows good governance practices. So for example, an investment that contributes to renewable energy or the reduction of greenhouse gases, or perhaps an investment that contributes to tackling inequality, these may be considered a sustainable investment. Article 8 funds or light green funds do not have sustainable investment as their investment objective or their reason for being, as it were. The recitals to the draft level 2 measures suggest that if the prospectus or indeed the marketing materials reference that sustainability factors are taken into account when deciding how to invest monies, this would bring the fund within the scope of the Article 8 disclosure requirements. An Article 9 fund or dark green fund, on the other hand, has as its objective investment in sustainable investments. Under the draft Level 2 measures, whilst an Article 9 fund can invest in investments other than sustainable investments, an Article 9 fund must disclose to investors how the share of investments that do not qualify as sustainable investments do not jeopardise the achievement of that sustainable investment objective. And the purpose behind this disclosure obligation is essentially to call out those funds which may label themselves as sustainable, but in reality invest significantly in investments which do not meet the criteria set down in order to constitute a sustainable investment. Just to mention also that IFAMA has called on the European supervisory authorities to provide greater clarity on the distinction between Article 8 and Article 9 funds, suggesting that Article 9 or Article 8 funds rather should capture a broader range of investments, integrating environmental and social characteristics with different approaches and different levels of ambition. I'll now hand back to Cillian, who's going to provide a very useful summary on how to navigate the ESG framework.
Thank you, Aisling. Well, we have now been through the key relevant pieces of legislation, as well as outlining some of the key concepts of the framework and who needs to be concerned with it. On that basis, we thought it would be useful to include this next slide to assist you in digesting this information and to help you to assess exactly what needs to be done in order to ensure that you do not fall foul of the requirements. In short, these are the questions you need to ask yourselves as you look across a range of products that you manage. So, firstly, do I manage any ESG funds? If the answer is no, then only Articles 3 to 7 of the disclosure regulations will be relevant. The taxonomy regulation will not be relevant except for certain disclaimers that will need to be provided in that regard. If the answer to the question is yes, that you do manage ESG funds, then the next question is whether these funds can be categorized as either Article 8 or Article 9 funds, which Aisling has just described to you. Once that exercise has been completed, the next consideration is whether the ESG funds you manage promote environmental characteristics or pursue environmental objectives. If the answer to that question is yes, then both the taxonomy regulations and all of the disclosure regulations will apply. If the answer is no, then all of the disclosure regulations will be relevant, but the taxonomy regulations will not apply. So really one of the key takeaways from today's webinar is that this classification exercise is something which all managers will need to carry out in order to assess the impact of the ESG framework on them and the funds that they manage. Moving on then to the next slide, and bearing in mind what we've just discussed, we are now going to focus in a little bit more detail on the most pressing of the ESG requirements which managers are currently facing, and that is the disclosure regulations. So this is arguably the most onerous of the legislative requirements, and aside from the benchmark regulation, these are the changes which will first be felt by managers and their funds as it comes into force on the 10th of March next year. So in this section, I'm going to highlight 3 key points in relation to the disclosure regulations. Firstly, I'm going to give you an update as regards the timing of these regulations. Then I will bring you through the impact of the regulations on managers themselves and how that impact can depend on the size of the manager. And finally, then I will explain what the regulations mean for the fund or product itself and how ESG funds are affected to a greater degree by these legislative requirements. To begin then with some initial important points as regards timing. So firstly, just to note that the disclosure regulations comprise of level 1 measures which set out the disclosure obligations at a very high level without providing any detailed information on how those disclosure obligations should be complied with. However, for the disclosures applicable to ESG funds and principal adverse impact reporting obligations, which I'll discuss in a minute, we will also have very detailed level 2 measures, which will take the form of a Commission delegated regulation. But these level 2 measures specify in very precise terms what information must be provided by managers in order to comply with the rules applicable to ESG funds and principal adverse impact reporting, and these have not yet been finalised. They usually, and as you would expect, level 1 and level 2 measures apply from the same date, and indeed this was the original intention with respect to the disclosure regulations. However, we now know that level 2 measures will not enter into effect on the 10th of March 2021 as was planned, but instead will apply at a later date. Now, unfortunately, the European Commission hasn't given an indication as to what it means by a later date, but a current guess will be the 1st of January 2022. More on that a little bit later on. But focusing back on the slide itself again, we'll now look at what needs to be disclosed under the disclosure regulations. Firstly, as the name suggests, the impact of this regulation is that new disclosures must be made by management companies and their funds in order to allow investors to understand the environmental and social impact of their investment decisions and to help them recognize which investments are sustainable and which are not. So essentially providing additional information in a systematic way to investors to assist them in this regard. Secondly, while the entities in scope, as we have heard from Aisling, are financial market participants, i.e. it's the manager as opposed to the fund or the product, these disclosure obligations impact both the manager itself and the funds under management. As has already been mentioned, the extent of the obligations imposed on managers and impacting the funds under these regulations will depend very much on whether the manager manages ESG funds or not. And I'm now going to bring you through what needs to be done depending on whether you do or you don't manage ESG funds. As you might expect, if it's a case where you manage both, then naturally all of these requirements will need to be taken into account when you are tailoring your response to the ESG framework for each of these products. Looking first at the requirements placed on managers under the disclosure regulations, the manager is required to provide certain information around its investment processes on its website, and this information needs to be kept up to date. Remembering the key concepts that we've discussed earlier on, this includes providing information on its policies and integrating sustainability risk into the investment decision-making processes. It also includes providing information to investors on whether, and if so how, the manager considers the principal adverse impacts of its investment decisions on sustainability factors. Now, for this obligation, the size of the manager is important to bear in mind, and this is because management companies with more than 500 employees, as well as smaller management companies who voluntarily choose to opt up, must disclose information on how they take into account sustainability factors when making investment decisions. So without doubt, the most significant consequence here is the obligation to report on the principal adverse sustainability impact of underlying investments in respect of each reporting period. Now, this becomes particularly clear when we look at the draft level 2 measures, which set out how this obligation should be complied with. The European supervisory authorities have proposed that this be assessed and reported by the manager using 32 mandatory indicators, and for some good measure, some optional indicators, which are also set down in the draft level 2 measures. So look, just to give you a better idea of what's involved here, for example, environmental mandatory indicators would include reporting on the share of investments in entities without a deforestation policy, while, for example, proposed social mandatory indicators include the average gender pay gap of investee companies. Two key additional points in this respect. Firstly, this obligation arises regardless of whether or not you manage an ESG fund. And secondly, if the manager, due to its size, decides to explain rather than comply, it must, from the 10th of March next year, publish a statement on its website outlining clear reasons for why they do not consider principal adverse impacts on sustainability factors when they're making investment decisions. Just on that particular point, we think it will be interesting to see whether the majority of ESG managers who don't meet the 500 employee test decide to opt up to this additional reporting requirement, for example, in order to avoid negative ramifications arising from having to post that statement on their websites. Finally then, as regards managers' obligations, the manager is also required to update its remuneration policy to include information on how the remuneration policy is consistent with the integration of sustainability risks. So in other words, the remuneration structure should be such that employees are not encouraged to take excessive risk with respect to sustainability risks. Moving on then to the next slide, we will look now at the types of disclosure that must be included in prospectuses of all funds, regardless of whether you're an ESG or a non-ESG fund. So firstly, a key point is that all fund prospectuses should disclose the manner in which sustainability risk is taken into account in the investment decision-making process. It should also include the results of an assessment of the likely impact of sustainability risks on the returns of the fund. So we're presuming that will take the form of a risk factor or similar. If the manager does not take into account sustainability risks when it's making investment decisions, you'll have to explain that to investors within your prospectus and explain why you don't do so. It's very important in this regard to note that there's no additional level 2 measures to provide any further guidance on how managers should meet the disclosure obligations relating to the integration of sustainability risks, and there won't be. Another point to note is that from the 30th of December 2022, the prospectus should also address whether or not the manager considers the principal adverse impacts of their investment decisions on sustainability factors, which we discussed earlier in the context of the manager obligations. The disclosure to be included naturally is going to vary depending on whether the manager is choosing to comply or complying, or explaining why they are not taking into consideration when deciding how to invest. Now, as you might expect, if you are managing ESG funds, there is going to be additional information which will need to be provided to investors. This needs to be provided via the prospectus, the manager's website, and the annual reports. The intention in this regard is to ensure the investor is provided with or given access to that ESG related information, not only prior to investing, for example, by way of the prospectus, but throughout the life of an investment. So for example, by way of annual reports. Now, unlike the disclosure for non-ESG funds, the nature of these disclosures will be very prescriptive under the draft level 2 measures, where the information to be included in the prospectus is quite granular, including, just for example, the planned proportion of investment in sustainable investments in the prospectus, and then reporting on the actual proportion of investments in sustainable investments in the annual report of the fund. Although not of immediate relevance for this 10th of March deadline next year, it's worthwhile pointing out that the European supervisory authorities propose that level 2 measures provide the prospectus and annual reports should follow a template disclosure to improve comparability of financial products. And they've released a mock-up template in September as part of a survey in that regard. In terms of annual reports, ESG funds must also provide ESG-related information to investors in their annual report. In terms of the timing of those disclosures, the current view is that these disclosure obligations apply for the accounting period beginning on or after the 1st of January 2022. Unfortunately, this is not yet entirely clear from the legislation. Finally then, with respect to marketing communications, it's worth noting that regardless of whether or not you manage an ESG fund, managers are required under the disclosure regulations to ensure that the ESG-related information contained in the fund's marketing materials don't contradict the ESG-related information which is disclosed to investors by way of a fund's prospectus, website, or annual reports. So from that perspective, an action for managers is they should ensure that a cross-check of the marketing materials is carried out in order to remove any inconsistent ESG-related information. So with that then, I'll hand you back over to Aisling to discuss the taxonomy regulations.
Thank you, Cillian. The purpose behind these particular regulations is essentially to create an EU-wide classification system or framework for sustainable investment. And adopting a consistent framework is expected to reduce the practice of greenwashing, which Cillian referenced at the outset. As regards the type of funds that will be impacted under the taxonomy regulation, detailed disclosure obligations only arise under the taxonomy regulation if the fund in question is an ESG fund and either promotes an environmental characteristic or invests in an economic activity that contributes to an environmental characteristic. As regards the disclosure requirements, these will apply to the prospectus and the annual report of an ESG environmentally sustainable fund. And the information to be disclosed will include the environmental characteristic being contributed to, how and to what extent underlying investments are considered to be environmentally sustainable using criteria set down in the taxonomy regulation. And I'll elaborate on what is meant by environmentally sustainable in a moment. And they must also disclose the proportion of investments in environmentally sustainable economic activities as a percentage of the total investments selected for a fund. Also, just to note that for non-ESG funds, they will be required to include a short disclaimer in both their prospectus and annual report, which simply states the investments underlying this financial product do not take into account the EU criteria for environmentally sustainable economic activities. It's not yet clear whether ESG funds which pursue social characteristics or objectives as opposed to environmental characteristics or objectives must include the same disclaimer in the prospectus and annual report as non-ESG funds. However, we do know that if, for example, you manage an Article 8 fund which promotes a social characteristic, you will not be subject to the additional detailed disclosure obligations under the taxonomy regulation. Interestingly enough, some commentators are concerned that the taxonomy regulation will encourage investment in environmentally sustainable funds to the detriment of those funds which pursue a social objective. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Moving on then to the next slide. I mentioned a moment ago that both the prospectus and the annual report of an ESG environmentally sustainable fund will be required to detail how and to what extent underlying investments are considered to be environmentally sustainable. And in order for an activity to be environmentally sustainable, there are 4 criteria to be met. But before I mention those 4 criteria, it's worth mentioning at this point that under the taxonomy regulation, there are 6 environmental objectives. Briefly summarised, they are climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and then finally, protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. In order then for an activity to be environmentally sustainable, it must not only significantly contribute to one of the environmental objectives I just outlined, but the activity also cannot harm any of the other environmental objectives. It must also comply with minimum social safeguards, namely the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And it must also comply with technical screening criteria set down by the European Commission. And these technical screening criteria will be set down in the level 2 measures. Finally, with regard to timing, the taxonomy regulation will take effect on a staggered basis. For funds which contribute to climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, the effective date is 1st of January 2022. And for those funds then which contribute to any of the remaining 4 environmental objectives, the effective date is 1st of January 2023. Moving on then to the next slide. This is the final piece of legislation which we'll look at today and relates to changes which are proposed to the AIFMD and UCITS framework, specifically with regard to the integration of sustainability risks and sustainability factors. And the areas that are impacted are organisational requirements, risk management and operating conditions. And these changes will impact UCITS management companies and AIFMs as well as self-managed UCITS and AIFs. Very briefly, in the context of organisational requirements, relevant entities will be required to take into account sustainability risks in establishing and implementing their organisational structure. And they must also have the necessary resources and expertise for the effective integration of sustainability risks. With regard to risk management procedures will be required to assess exposure to sustainability risk. And finally, as regards operating conditions, when identifying conflicts of interest, the relevant entity must take into account conflicts arising as a result of the integration of sustainability risks. When conducting due diligence on investments, they must take into account sustainability risks. And where principal adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors are considered, due diligence requirements must also take these into account. As regards the timing of these changes, we understand that the changes will be finalised very shortly with the 1-year transitional period. Therefore, we expect management companies and self-managed funds to have to comply with these new rules from Q4 next year at the earliest. Bottom line, what does this mean for management companies and self-managed funds? Well, essentially, these entities will need to start giving due consideration to complying with these requirements by reviewing their organisational requirements, senior management and board level expertise, risk framework and risk management policies, due diligence policies and conflicts of interest policies. And the business plan and programme of activity will also require revision as a result of these legislative changes. With that, I'll now hand back to Cillian, who will leave you with some key takeaways from the webinar.
Thank you very much, Aisling. Now, we appreciate that there's been quite a lot of detail provided in today's webinar on a topic which really is new to many of us. So we thought it would be worthwhile ending with 4 key action points for managers and funds to ensure that they're in a position to comply with their obligations under the disclosure regulations come the 10th of March next year. So the first action point, managers will need to carry out a review of all funds under management to determine whether or not they constitute an ESG fund. This step is critical as it will determine the scope of the disclosures which will need to be made. So if the manager, for example, has ESG funds under management, work can then begin on gathering the necessary information which will be needed to draft relevant prospectus and website disclosures required for ESG funds. Second action point, managers should then discuss with the investment management and risk management teams as to how sustainability risk is currently being incorporated into the investment decision-making process. As we've outlined, information on this will need to be disclosed on the manager's website and in the prospectus of all funds under management, and that's regardless of whether or not they manage an ESG fund. The third action point is that fund managers will need to determine whether they need to disclose information on how they consider the principal adverse impacts of their investment decisions on sustainability factors. As discussed, smaller managers can choose to opt out of this disclosure obligation, but they must still update their website to explain why they do not consider these impacts and whether they intend to consider them in the future. Finally then, managers will need to consider their remuneration structure and how it does not encourage excessive risk-taking with respect to sustainability risk. And they'll need to update their remuneration policy to reflect this. So really, it's only once the manager goes through each of these steps that the real work, unfortunately, around drafting disclosures and revision to policies can begin. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. And with that, I would like to thank you again for listening. And I'll now hand you back over to Clodagh, to the Q&A section of today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Killian and Aisling, for those insights. We've gone slightly over time, so we'll get to maybe one or two questions. The first question, Killian, I'm going to direct it to you.
Sure.
So what impact will the delay in the application date of the level 2 measures mean for fund managers?
Thanks, Clodagh. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question at the moment. Well, I suppose in essence, what this delay means is that website disclosures and prospectuses will still need to be revised to include all of the information applicable to non-ESG funds and some high-level information on ESG funds from the 10th of March 2021. So this is in order to ensure that the manager complies with obligations under level 1. However, once the level 2 measures enter into force, and managers will be required to update some of the disclosures made on their website. So for example, with respect to principal adverse impact reporting and also with respect to ESG funds. And the prospectuses for ESG funds will also need to be updated to provide additional information which is required under the level 2 measures. So practically speaking, let's presume for a minute that the level 2 measures will enter into force on the 1st of January 2022, which Aisling mentioned happens to coincide with the date in which some of the disclosures under the taxonomy regulations must be made. So if that is the case, certain disclosures will need to be made on the manager's website and the fund prospectuses by the 10th of March next year under level 1, as I just mentioned, but there'll also be disclosures required to be made and revised 9 months later on the 1st of January 2022, for example, in order to comply with those level 2 measures. So really what this will mean is that revision will need to be made to information contained on the website, but also unfortunately to the prospectuses of ESG funds within a very short space of time. So, that's assuming that it's the 1st of January 2022. So not ideal really from that point of view. But I suppose one point maybe just to finally mention in that respect is that Irish Funds, which is a lobbying body for the funds industry in Ireland, has made a submission to the Central Bank of Ireland calling for it to confirm that a self-certification procedure will apply for UCITS and retail AIFs, which are making ESG related changes to their prospectuses in advance of the 10th of March 2021. So I suppose we'll watch this space in that regard to see if any developments, if there are any developments from that perspective. Keep you posted in that regard. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Killian. Thank you. And Aisling, another one coming in. I'm going to direct this one to you. So are you seeing many of your clients choosing to opt up to the principal adverse impact reporting requirements?
Thank you, Clodagh. Maybe before I answer that, just to recap, if you're opting up, it means you're not subject to the mandatory reporting requirement because you've less than 500 employees, but you're voluntarily choosing to comply with the reporting requirements. I suppose at this stage, we're seeing managers of ESG funds certainly giving serious thought to opting up, and the primary reason being, and Killian mentioned this during the webinar, they're concerned that they could be negatively impacted if they, as managers of ESG funds, essentially disclose on their websites that they don't take into account adverse impacts on sustainability factors when they're making their investment decisions. I suppose A possible deterrent from opting up would certainly be the data challenges which will arise if the draft level 2 measures are implemented as currently drafted. Insofar as Cillian mentioned, there are 32 indicators, mandatory indicators against which you have to report, plus additional indicators on top of that. So I suppose whilst the majority of our ESG clients haven't made the final decision on this yet, at the moment, my sense is that they will likely seek to comply. Then I suppose what we're seeing as regards managers with no ESG funds, they certainly tend to be adopting a wait and see approach, not looking to immediately opt up, but they may consider opting up at a later date, I suppose once the draft level 2 measures have been finalised and they know exactly what they're dealing with, coupled with the fact that this also, of course, will give them an opportunity to assess the approach being taken by their competitors. So I hope that gives some sense maybe of what we're hearing from managers at this time with regard to whether or not they will opt up or not.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Aisling. I'm very conscious of the time and we're not going to get to all the questions coming in today. So I'd like to thank Cillian and Aisling for those insights, and to all of you who attended today. We look forward to seeing you at the next Dillon Eustace Fund Insights webinar. It's on the ESG and it's a case study on implementation. And that is scheduled for the 18th of November at 2:30 p.m. An invite will issue shortly. We will send a copy of today's presentation to everybody who attended. And if you're interested in listening back to this presentation, it will be available on our website early next week. So in the meantime, if you have any questions on the ESG framework or how to comply with it, please feel free to reach out to our presenters, Cillian and Aisling. Their email address is now on the screen, or maybe your usual Dillon Eustace contact. Thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.